Why is multi-causal thinking so difficult for human beings? Most complex phenomena that we can observe don't have a single cause, but can be approached from the perspective of having multiple causes. This is something that is difficult for our brain to grasp initially because it goes against our conception of causality. Our everyday conception of causality is derived from the human experience that you are an agent, that you have will, and that you can impose your will on the world. So when you push against the building or when you push against the world and the world reacts, this is the prototype for what we consider to be causality. And in these situations, so when you're trying to exert some kind of force on reality, when you're trying to change reality, so as to match it with your own expectations of reality, this is something that you already do as a child on a pre-linguistic level. The moment you have desires, the moment you have certain forms of intentions, and you try to express those intentions through your bodily movements, and to exert some kind of force, some kind of influence on the world surrounding you. The moment you do that, and you're capable of doing that repeatedly, you have a conception of causality. And this conception of causality rests on the idea that there is you, and there is one you, wanting something, and through your body, finding a way of expressing that wanting to the world, and forcing the world to obey your will. Right? Waiting for the world to respond to what you want. So when you push something, when you push an object, or when you pull an object, you have this push-pull relationship where there is only you who have a will, and there is the object at the center of your attention that you want to influence through your action. So there's basically two elements, you and the object that you're trying to influence through your actions. And you don't need more than that. This is enough for our everyday understanding of causality. And if you think about it, most of the day we're experiencing everything surrounding us in terms of this conception of causality. So whenever you want to understand something, you turn on your computer and you start looking for something. So you do one thing. You have one thing in mind that you want to understand, want to know, and you go searching for that one thing. You go on typing and searching for what you're looking for. So there is usually just one thing that we're keeping in mind. We're incapable of tracking multiple things at a time. We're incapable of multitasking. And this conception of causality is linked not so much to how the world really works or how the world really is structured, but is much more an expression of how our consciousness is structured, how we experience reality. If you look at phenomena in the world, it is very easy to show, and this is what philosophers have been doing like for millennia, that this conception of causality doesn't really work. Imagine an apple falling from a tree. What is the cause for an apple falling from a tree? If you start asking the question, you'll figure out there is not one single cause. Now, is the reason for the apple falling from a tree the wind blowing at a specific moment in time? If you think about it, it's not enough, because for an apple to fall from the tree, also the stem of the apple has to be weak enough so that when the wind is blowing, the apple will fall from the tree. And you can go on and on and on. It seems like when you're looking at the world around you, there seldomly are single causes, except where human beings are involved. Where you're observing phenomena where human beings are involved, single causes oftentimes are explanatory and are enough. You don't need to think particularly in particularly complex ways, because oftentimes human action is driven by single intentions and single things that you have in your mind. And once those are missing, or once those are in place, actions change significantly. And all you have to figure out is those beliefs being there or not being there, and why they're there or not there, to actually explain a certain situation. But outside the human realm, or outside the realm of consciousness, if you want, you don't find such single causes. Everything you look at has usually multiple causes, or can be conceptualized as having multiple causes. And what philosophers have then oftentimes concluded from this is that causality itself is just a human-like, it's an anthropomorphic concept, which we can't really prove to be a feature of reality itself. I myself am not particularly happy with this kind of argument. I would rather flip it and argue in the opposite direction, and argue that consciousness is not something that's outside the world. It's not something that is distinct from reality. But our way of perceiving reality is all the way down to the most simple organisms, already coordinated with the reality that is surrounding it. If it weren't, it wouldn't exist. I mean, this is the rather trivial evolutionary argument. If your consciousness were not, in some form, in some fashion, adapted to match the reality surrounding you and to feel the reality surrounding you, you would not be able to survive as an organism. And this goes back to organisms that are pretty stupid and pretty mindless, but still have some form of mind and still have some form of, as Wilber puts it, some form of perception of the reality surrounding them. They already are in touch. They already literally are touching the environment surrounding them, even though they can't represent the environment surrounding them in all of its complexity. So they're touching reality, but for example, oftentimes they can't distinguish, these simple organisms, I mean, can't distinguish a living from a non-living environment surrounding them. Higher organisms can make the distinction. They can distinguish, and they can even feel into different forms of living organisms surrounding them. However this may be, I think the lesson that we can take from the whole thing is that causality is indeed a human concept. It is indeed linked to the way, not so much reality is structured as such, but linked to the way we perceive reality, to the way our consciousness is making sense of reality. And the concept of causality tells us, at the very least, something about ourselves. It tells us something about how we perceive reality, if not necessarily about what is most adequate in a certain situation. Again, if you want to understand certain complex situations, you can't really use the concept of a single cause that is so typical of the embodied experience of causation, where again you have you the actor and the one thing that you're acting upon. That's a bad model if you want to understand overall complex situations. And being aware of that is important, because once you're aware of that, once you're aware of causality as being a human construct, you can then consciously start for looking for different mutually supportive causal explanations in a given situation. So for example, politics, right? When you look at political situations, how do you figure out what the cause is for a specific war, right? If you were following the primary human intuition of causation, you would look for the one thing that has caused the war. And this is not how you can approach this situation. When you're approaching such complex situations, you will have to look at multiple different areas of causation, and you have to correlate them. So when you're looking at wars, it's not just socioeconomic circumstances that cause wars. Beliefs and intentions are equally important. You have to look at the beliefs and intentions that are involved in situations of wars. You have to look at the way human beings organize, right? You have to look at the hierarchical structure of what the leading elite of a specific people is believing, what they take to be real, what they take to be important. You will have to look and take into account the historical aspect of a region. So we will have to see how certain beliefs, how a region represents its environment. For example, what do certain people think about the other side, and what do they think about the world surrounding them? All of those are relevant factors that you have to take into account if you want to get properly informed and to be able to properly understand any kind of complex social conflict. Those social conflicts involve human beings, which again are oftentimes driven by simple push-pull causality conceptions. But the point still is that human action is not determined by our conceptions of push-pull causality. So oftentimes we do things and don't really know why we're doing things. they are not exhausted, our actions are not exhausted in our self-understanding and the self-transparency that we have over our actions, but are all also co-determined by environmental factors that we usually are not aware of. Oftentimes you do things and don't really know why you do, and when you look closer, you see you're doing them because you're part, for example, of a family system, or you're part of a cultural system that you have inherited without necessarily being even aware of it. And those are things that you will have to have a look at. So when we are involved in any kind of complex situation like that, single causality conceptions, as we are used to them, just don't do us a favor and reduce complex situations down to one single path and one single flat narrative that supposedly explains it all. And obviously nobody else will agree. Nobody else who is looking at the situation and doesn't have your particular bias and doesn't have your particular preferences when looking and analyzing situations, nobody would agree. And they would, of course, come up with their own linear narratives, which itself is something that causes social conflict between human beings. And this is important to keep in mind. When we're facing such phenomena, we can't approach them with the single cause lens, which is so typical of human embodied experience and something that everybody understands. This is the way we usually conceive of causality, because it's the primal way of conceiving causality. Before we are anything else, we are actors in a world, right? Before we are anything else, we are agents who are trying to move the world to fit their will, right? To have a world self relationship where the world is submitting itself to your will. And this is something that everybody shares, and this is something thus that everybody understands. But we can't run on this conception of causality if we want to figure things out and not end up in endless conflict.